The podcast begins by discussing the current economic situation, noting a significant stock market sell-off and concerns about a potential recession. The Nasdaq and S&P 500 futures were down, with tech stocks like Nvidia, Meta, and Apple losing 6% or more. Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway had also reduced its stake in Apple. Ben Shapiro attributes these economic troubles to the policies of the Biden-Harris administration, particularly their spending initiatives like the Inflation Reduction Act. The podcast explains that the job market is softening, potentially signaling an upcoming recession. There are worries that the Federal Reserve has been too slow in cutting interest rates and now needs to catch up. Shapiro criticizes the idea that central banks should have such a significant role in manipulating job markets and the economy, arguing instead for a more predictable monetary and fiscal regime. The discussion then shifts to foreign policy, focusing on rising tensions in the Middle East. Shapiro strongly criticizes the Biden-Harris administration's approach to Iran and Israel. He argues that their policies have emboldened Iran and its proxies, leading to increased instability in the region. The podcast mentions the possibility of Iran launching a missile barrage at Israel or activating Hezbollah in northern Israel. Shapiro contrasts the current administration's approach with that of former President Trump, praising Trump's policy of containment and sanctions against Iran. He accuses the Biden administration of putting pressure on Israel rather than Iran, citing reports that President Biden had demanded Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu stop escalating tensions and move towards a ceasefire deal in Gaza. A significant portion of the podcast is dedicated to discussing Vice President Kamala Harris's position as the presumptive Democratic nominee for the 2024 presidential election. Shapiro notes that Harris has vaulted into a national polling lead according to Nate Silver's poll averages, with small leads in key swing states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. However, the podcast criticizes the lack of scrutiny Harris has faced, pointing out that she has not been asked a single difficult question in the 16 days since becoming the presumptive nominee. Shapiro argues that this is a deliberate strategy by the Harris campaign and the media to avoid exposing her to potential gaffes or policy weaknesses. The podcast discusses Donald Trump's campaign strategy, suggesting that he should challenge Harris to weekly debates on specific topics. Shapiro argues that this would expose Harris to public scrutiny and potentially harm her campaign, as he believes the more people see of Harris, the less they like her. He criticizes Trump's recent rally performance, where he attacked Georgia Governor Brian Kemp. He argues that Trump should focus his attacks solely on Harris and avoid getting sidetracked by personal grievances against other Republicans. The podcast covers speculation about Harris's potential vice presidential pick. It mentions several candidates being considered, including Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, and others. Shapiro discusses the pros and cons of each candidate, noting that Josh Shapiro seems to be the frontrunner, but faces opposition from some progressive Democrats due to his perceived pro-Israel stance. Throughout the podcast, Shapiro repeatedly criticizes the media for what he sees as biased coverage favoring the Harris campaign. He accuses journalists of failing to ask Harris tough questions and acting as a Praetorian Guard for her campaign. The podcast also touches on the challenges Republican candidates face in swing states, criticizing the party for running what he considers to be poor candidates in crucial races. The podcast delves into some personal controversies surrounding key figures in the Democratic Party. It mentions a story about Doug Emhoff, Kamala Harris's husband, admitting to an affair with a nanny years ago. Shapiro uses this to criticize what he sees as hypocrisy among Democratic elites who lecture others about morality. The podcast also discusses the ouster of President Biden as the Democratic nominee, describing it as a political coup orchestrated by party elites, including former President Obama, Nancy Pelosi, and Chuck Schumer. Shapiro argues that this demonstrates the professional nature of the Democratic Party's political machine. Returning to economic issues, the podcast criticizes the Federal Reserve's role in managing the economy. Shapiro argues that the central bank's attempts to manipulate job markets and inflation rates are misguided and lead to unpredictable economic outcomes. He suggests that a more stable and predictable monetary policy would be preferable.